It seemed like the perfect escape. Accepting the position of lighthouse keeper on a remote island felt like stepping into a long-cherished dream. I yearned for solitude, a reprieve from the endless noise and chaos of modern life. And this island, no more than a pinprick in the vast expanse of the sea, offered just that. The lighthouse itself stood like a solitary sentinel, its whitewashed tower brushing against the endless sky, a quiet witness to the passing of countless storms and centuries. I was eager to begin, so eager, in fact, that I barely thought twice about the previous keeper's abrupt departure, shrugging it off as a detail too insignificant to matter. At first, my days were a blissful blur. I quickly settled into the rhythm of the tides, the steady beam of the light, and the simple routines of maintenance. I mopped salt-crusted floors, checked the oil levels, and kept the lens polished. Time felt soft, pliable. The hours stretched and folded into one another, marked only by the setting sun and the constant, comforting thrum of the waves. I had all the solitude I craved. This was everything I had hoped for, so I thought. Then the storm hit, the worst I'd ever seen. Angry waves pounded the rocky shore while ferocious winds howled through every crack in the lighthouse's walls. For 3 straight days, the sky remained an angry slate gray, and the sea was more rage than water. The radio crackled its last faint signal before cutting out entirely, leaving me truly, deeply alone. I sat by the storm lamp at night, unable to sleep, listening to the storm scream like a living thing outside. It was frightening, sure, but it was also oddly exhilarating, a test of my resolve and of the lighthouse itself. When the storm finally passed, leaving the air bright and clean, I stepped out to assess the damage. The beach was littered with debris. Bits of driftwood, fragments of fishing nets, and seaweed tangled around stones. As I walked the shoreline, checking for anything that might threaten the lighthouse's foundations, my eyes caught something that made my breath catch. A single set of footprints. They trailed away from the lighthouse, heading into the dense thicket that cloaked much of the island's interior. They weren't mine, and there were no prints leading to the lighthouse, only away from it. For a moment, I stood frozen. My first instinct was to laugh it off. Maybe I hadn't noticed the footprints earlier. Maybe I had somehow made them myself in a forgotten moment. Maybe. But the excuses rang hollow even as I thought them. The prints were fresh, clear in the damp sand. Someone else had been here. The thought sent a cold shiver down my back. I was supposed to be alone. That was the deal, the dream. Who could have come to this isolated speck of land, miles from the nearest mainland? And why? I decided to investigate, each step into the undergrowth feeling heavier than the last. My boots crushed ferns and snapped twigs, but the footprints ahead of me seemed to glide over the terrain, untroubled by the messiness of the forest floor. As I pushed deeper, the trees closed in, their branches casting long, skeletal shadows. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, until I came across something that made me stop dead. In a small clearing, hidden by a canopy of leaves, stood a crumbling cottage. I hadn't seen it on any map, and the island's caretaker, whom I'd spoken to briefly before coming here, had never mentioned it. The walls were warped and green with moss, the roof half collapsed. A wooden door hung crooked on rusted hinges, and the single window was dark, its panes cracked. I stood there, staring at the place, heart thudding. The footprints led right up to it, vanishing at the threshold. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back. But curiosity, stubborn, relentless curiosity, won out. The air inside the cottage was damp, and the smell of decay was thick. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in heavy, drooping curtains. In one corner, there was a small wooden table piled with objects, an oil lamp, a rusted knife, and, most chilling of all, a thick leather-bound book. A diary. Its cover was cracked, the edges worn, but the pages inside were still legible. My fingers trembled as I flipped it open. The diary belonged to the previous keeper, the one who had vanished without explanation. His entries began innocuously enough, describing his daily chores and observations of the weather. But as the pages went on, the tone shifted. He wrote of hearing whispers in the wind, seeing shadows that moved against the light, and feeling a constant, suffocating presence. "I am not alone," he scrawled in jagged letters. "Something watches. It waits." My blood ran cold as I read his final entries. He wrote about the footprints, about the storm that cut off his communication, and about how the presence grew stronger, more oppressive. He described the cottage, said it felt like the heart of the island's darkness, and warned against venturing inside. "It binds us here," he wrote. "The lighthouse is a beacon, not just for ships, but for something far older, something that feeds on our isolation." I slammed the diary shut, my chest tight with fear. I could still feel that oppressive weight, that sense of being watched. I left the cottage quickly, the door creaking ominously behind me. By the time I reached the lighthouse, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the island cloaked in shadows. I locked every door, closed every window, and sat in the kitchen, clutching the diary like a talisman. The lighthouse, once my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Days turned into weeks, and the presence didn't leave. If anything, it grew bolder. I heard whispers at night, though I never saw anyone. Shadows danced at the edge of my vision. I tried to stay awake, tried to keep the light burning as if that would protect me. But even the light, steady and strong, seemed to falter at times, as if something was reaching out to smother it. I knew I couldn't live like this. I had to confront it, whatever it was. Following the hints in the diary, I discovered an old legend passed down by the mainlanders. They spoke of a curse, of keepers who disappeared without a trace, and of an ancient force tied to the lighthouse. The diary mentioned a rare event, a blood moon, when the barrier between our world and the unseen would be at its thinnest. It claimed that on this night, the lighthouse's beam could pierce through the darkness, breaking the cycle that bound keepers to the island. The night of the blood moon arrived, its crimson glow spilling across the sea. I climbed the narrow staircase to the top of the lighthouse, my hands shaking as I lit the lamp and directed the beam out over the water. The whispers turned into a roar, the shadows swirled in a frenzy, and the air grew heavy with a presence I could barely comprehend. But as the light cut through the darkness, something shifted. The oppressive weight lifted, and the whispers ceased. When the sun rose the next day, the island felt different. The air was lighter, the shadows just shadows. I stood at the edge of the sea, looking out at the calm water, and for the first time since arriving, I felt at peace. I had survived. More than that, I had freed myself from whatever haunted this place. The lighthouse remains a sentinel against the storm, its light a beacon of hope rather than despair. I still keep it, but now it feels like a choice, not a curse. The island, once a prison, has become my home, a place that reminds me that even in the darkest corners of the world, light can prevail. It began like any other night in the dimly lit studio of WLNK, the small local radio station where I hosted Whispers in the Dark. The show was my pride and joy, a late-night segment where listeners could call in to share their most chilling encounters with the paranormal, the unexplained, and the macabre. Over time, it had grown into something of a cult favorite. People tuned in not just for the ghost stories or eerie coincidences, but for the comfort of knowing they weren't alone in their fears. I'd hear about strange noises in the attic, a shadow figure at the foot of someone's bed, or a door that wouldn't stay closed no matter how many times it was locked. My job was to be their steady anchor, the calm voice in the night. And usually, that's exactly what I was. But not that night. The air that evening felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. The first few calls came in as usual, a local bartender who swore the jukebox played songs on its own, a woman who'd seen a figure staring at her through her second-story window, but they didn't carry the same chill. My mind was elsewhere. The studio's old fluorescent light hummed above me as I leaned back in the cracked leather chair, taking sips of lukewarm coffee and waiting for the next call. It came a few minutes before midnight. The line crackled faintly, and for a moment, I thought it was just static. Then a voice emerged, low, deliberate, almost a whisper. "I've done something," the caller said. I waited, expecting more. But the silence hung so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. What do you mean?" I asked, my voice steady despite the sudden prickling at the back of my neck. "I left something," the caller said, his tone eerily calm. "A gift, a testament. I don't think it can be undone." It sounded absurd at first, even laughable. My mind immediately went to pranksters and bored night owls looking to stir up trouble. But there was something in his voice's stillness that made my skin crawl. He spoke again, this time more quietly. "You'll find it, if you're worthy." Then, just as abruptly as he'd called, he hung up. I sat there for a moment, staring at the blinking red light on the phone console. The room seemed smaller, the air heavier. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to some listener taking the show's theme a bit too far. But as the minutes passed, the unease only grew. This wasn't a ghost story or an unexplained sighting. It felt like a confession. And then he called again. This time, his voice was softer, almost coaxing. "You're getting close," he murmured. "Keep going." I hadn't even moved. I hadn't done anything except listen. "Close to what?" I asked. "Who are you?" "Just keep listening," he replied. And then, once more, the line went dead. The third call came at 12:15. Another riddle, another piece of the puzzle. Each time he called, he gave a vague hint, a landmark, a direction, a time. He was leading me somewhere, slowly pulling me into a game I never agreed to play. And as the calls continued, the details grew darker. He spoke of a place near the station, of something hidden in plain sight. His words were cryptic, his tone disturbingly calm. The listeners were enthralled, their texts and tweets flooding the station's feed. Everyone wanted to know what was happening. I had become the centerpiece of a story I couldn't control. Finally, just past 1 a.m., he called again. "It's time," he whispered. "I'll be waiting." Something broke inside me then. A mixture of anger and dread took over. I couldn't just sit there anymore. Leaving the station in the hands of my producer, I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the night. The streets were quiet, the air cold. Following the vague directions the caller had given me, I walked toward an old, abandoned warehouse not far from the station. The building loomed in the darkness, its broken windows like hollow eyes. My flashlight beam jittered across the crumbling bricks and peeling paint as I stepped inside. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. In the center of the empty warehouse was a table, and on it lay an object draped in a stained cloth. My stomach churned as I approached, pulling the cloth back with trembling fingers. Beneath it was a small, rusted metal box. Inside, photographs, dozens of them. They were all of me. At work, at the coffee shop, walking home. Some were taken from such odd angles that I had no idea how they were even possible. In one, I was sitting at my desk at WLNK, my back to the camera. I was utterly alone that night, or so I thought. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a piece of debris. My head swam. Who was this caller? How long had he been following me? And what exactly had I gotten myself into? As the truth settled over me, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A new text from an unknown number. "Did you enjoy my gift?" I didn't reply. Instead, I ran. Out of the warehouse, back toward the station, where the studio's familiar glow offered some small comfort. By the time I got there, the caller's number was blocked, and I informed the police. They never found him, and I never heard from him again. But I still think about that night, the one time I stopped being just a voice in the dark and became part of the story. To this day, I wonder, who was he really? What did he want from me? And was that the end, or just the beginning? That first day in the suburbs, everything seemed perfect. The tree-lined streets, the white picket fences, and the friendly neighbors who greeted us with welcoming smiles. After years of cramped city living, we were ready for the peace and quiet we'd always dreamed of. Even the kids seemed to settle in instantly, making friends with other children on the block and spending their afternoons riding bikes and playing hide and seek. It was idyllic, the kind of place we thought only existed on postcards. But things started to change in ways we couldn't ignore. At first, it was small. The Johnsons, the family who lived next door, disappeared. One evening, their house was filled with light, laughter, and the faint sound of music. The next morning, it was silent. No moving trucks, no goodbye. Just an empty house. We figured they'd left in a hurry, maybe an emergency relocation for work. Yet weeks passed, and the Johnsons didn't return. The curtains remained drawn, the driveway bare, and then another house went dark. Then another. One by one, Families who had once waved to us on their morning walks vanished without a trace. Soon, we noticed the symbols. They started as faint marks, little scrawls near front doors or faint patterns on garage doors. At first, we assumed it was graffiti, maybe some kids playing pranks. But the symbols grew more intricate, more deliberate. The designs seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as though they were alive. The air around them felt heavy, charged with something we couldn't explain. My wife suggested we investigate the Johnsons' house. We didn't plan on breaking in. We just wanted to peek through the windows, see if there were any signs of what had happened. What we saw inside was unsettling. The dining room table was set as if the family had just sat down for dinner. Plates and cups still in place. A chair pushed back as if someone had stood up suddenly. Upstairs, clothes were laid out neatly, waiting to be worn. It was as if they'd vanished in the middle of living, everything untouched since the moment they left. Unable to let it go, we began digging into the neighborhood's history. The local library, dusty archives, and old microfilm reels became our new weekend haunts. That's when we stumbled on something chilling. This wasn't the first time. Disappearances had been happening in the area for decades. Families would move in, enjoy a few months of suburban bliss, and then vanish. Each time, strange symbols were found at the houses, like a calling card or a warning. Digging deeper, we discovered something even more disturbing. Before it was a neighborhood, the land had been home to a sprawling, mysterious estate. The estate's owner was an enigmatic figure, rumored to dabble in the occult. Locals spoke of strange gatherings, chants that carried through the night, and an aura of unease that hung over the grounds. When the estate burned down under suspicious circumstances, the land was left untouched for decades. It was only after the tragedy had faded into memory that developers built the neighborhood on top of it. The symbols, we realized, were more than marks. They were sigils tied to a ritual that had never been completed. We weren't just living in a neighborhood. We were living in the aftermath of something dark and unfinished. The houses that became empty, marked with those symbols, weren't abandoned by choice. They were claimed. The people inside were taken, erased, leaving behind no trace except for the faint, ominous patterns that continued to spread. Determined not to let our family be next, we sought out anyone who could help. Eventually, we found a historian on the edge of town. His house was filled with books on folklore, dusty tomes on ancient symbols, and old journals passed down through generations. At first, he refused to talk about it, but when we showed him photos of the symbols, his face turned pale. He finally admitted that he'd studied the land years ago, trying to understand the strange events that surrounded it. He confirmed our worst fears. The symbols were part of a summoning, a way to bridge the living world and something far darker. The ritual had been incomplete for decades, but its energy still lingered, seeking to finish what had been started. Together, we devised a plan. If we could find certain artifacts linked to the estate's original owner, hidden items that tied him to the land, we could potentially reverse the energy, sever the connection, and stop the disappearances. Each item was rumored to be hidden in the marked houses, concealed by those who had vanished. So we started searching, sneaking into homes that stood abandoned, feeling like trespassers even though we knew it was our only chance. What we encountered in those houses defied explanation. Shadows moved where there shouldn't be movement. Whispers echoed through empty rooms. It was as if the walls themselves held memories of what had happened. In one house, we found a locket that belonged to the estate's mistress, tucked behind a floorboard. In another, a fragment of a journal burned at the edges but still legible. Piece by piece, we gathered these remnants, feeling the air grow heavier with every discovery. On the night of the winter solstice, when the veil between worlds was thinnest, we performed the ritual to break the cycle. Following the historian's instructions, we arranged the artifacts in a circle in the center of the original estate's grounds, now the neighborhood's park. As we spoke the incantations, the air vibrated with a strange energy. The ground trembled, and a cold wind howled through the trees. The symbols on the houses began to glow faintly, then faded. Finally, silence. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere lifted. The homes that had been silent for so long now seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Over time, new families moved into the once abandoned houses. The symbols never returned. We'd broken the chain, severed the dark energy that had haunted this place for generations. But every now and then, I still wonder, was the ritual truly complete? Did we really close the door forever? Or is it only a matter of time before the symbols begin to reappear, starting the cycle anew? The glossy it had seemed so innocent. Quick cash, it had promised. For those willing to help advance psychological research. No skills required. Just some simple tests, a few days at a research facility on the edge of town, and a paycheck in hand. For someone like me, always looking for a quick way to make ends meet, it was hard to resist. Little did I know, I just signed up for an experiment that would go far beyond questionnaires and harmless group activities. The facility stood like a modern fortress, all sharp angles and reflective glass, surrounded by dense woods. A sleek, secure oasis far from prying eyes. On my first day, the staff welcomed us warmly. They wore crisp white coats and carried clipboards, all smiles and reassurances. They walked us through the schedule, basic surveys, some memory exercises, maybe a little time in a sensory deprivation tank. Easy money, I thought. The hardest part would be killing time in between tests. For the first few days, that's exactly how it felt, like a slightly boring but otherwise benign job. We filled out forms, sat in on group sessions where we discussed our dreams and fears, and completed what seemed like random cognitive tasks. The staff treated us well, making sure we had good meals and comfortable rooms. We could even unwind in the lounge area, where a handful of us would swap stories about the other odd jobs we'd taken before landing here. Then, something shifted. The questions became more probing, the tests more intense. One night, they woke us up at odd hours and shuffled us into separate rooms. We were made to watch hours of disjointed images and listen to a cacophony of sounds. At first, I brushed it off as another step in their research, but the sheer duration, hours spent with no breaks, no explanation, started to wear on me. It wasn't just me. The other participants seemed off too. Restless, distracted, uneasy, and then people began to disappear. First, it was just one person, a young guy named Andrew. He was quiet but friendly. We talked about music the day before, and I remember him saying he couldn't wait to get home and start recording again. Then he simply wasn't there. When I asked one of the staff members, they said he had left the study early due to illness. But there were no goodbyes, no send-off. He just vanished. In the following days, more participants disappeared. The explanations grew thinner. Some, the staff claimed, had gotten cold feet and left. Others had been excused for health reasons. Yet no one had mentioned feeling sick before they went. It felt off, like the staff was scrambling to cover something up. Their smiles no longer felt warm. Their responses were short, clipped. My fellow participants and I began whispering in the hallways, our laughter replaced by guarded glances. We formed a small group, 4 of us, who decided to dig deeper. It started with a simple decision: stay up late and watch the staff. We took turns pretending to sleep while the others peeked through the doors of the lounge. We noticed something strange. Staff members were walking down corridors we hadn't seen before, hidden entrances that seemed to lead deeper into the building. We'd seen no signs of Andrew or the others who had left. Instead, we heard muffled sounds, saw shadowy figures through frosted glass panels, and once, late at night, caught sight of a gurney being wheeled into a room we were not allowed to enter. That was when we knew we weren't here for psychological research. Not the kind they described. The smiling staff had been performing some other kind of test. On us. The nights became increasingly harrowing. Our dreams, or what felt like dreams, were vivid and twisted. Each morning we'd wake up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching us as we slept. We began to see things that didn't add up. Monitors on walls that seemed to flicker and display images of us when we weren't looking. Doors that locked at seemingly random times. Even certain staff members who looked different. It was hard to describe. Not older, exactly, but as though something had drained them of vitality. As we pieced together clues, we found a hidden office. It wasn't easy. One of us kept watch at the door while the rest rifled through files and video feeds stored on an old computer terminal. What we discovered was worse than any of us had imagined. This wasn't just an experiment to study stress responses or memory under pressure. The files revealed a project with no name, only a code, Subject Resilience Protocol. Its goal wasn't to observe mild psychological discomfort. It was to push people, us, to the breaking point. The staff's job wasn't to guide us, but to manipulate us, monitor our descent into paranoia, and record how far they could drive us before we cracked. Those who disappeared had failed, or perhaps succeeded too well at playing their twisted game. We couldn't rely on the authorities. A facility like this, buried in the woods and clearly funded by shadowy, well-connected organizations, wasn't going to be taken down by a single phone call to the local police. We needed to escape and bring proof of what was happening. It wasn't easy. The building seemed designed to trap us. Cameras were everywhere. Hallways didn't lead where they should. The panic inside our group reached a boiling point. One of us, Marianne, nearly broke, yelling that we'd never get out. But we calmed her down, reminding each other that we weren't alone, that we'd made it this far together. We planned our escape meticulously, mapping out the times when the shifts changed, noting when certain hallways went dark. When the moment came, we didn't hesitate. We slipped through a back corridor, reached the main server room, and downloaded everything we could onto a flash drive. As alarms blared, we ran for the emergency exits. I can still hear the pounding of my heart from that night, the way my breath caught when I heard footsteps closing in behind us. But we made it out. In the end, we didn't just escape. We exposed them. The files we took contained everything: video evidence, written directives, signed contracts from shadowy backers who thought their actions would remain hidden. The media latched onto the story, and the public's outrage forced authorities to intervene. The facility was shut down, its staff and sponsors hauled into investigations and legal battles. But the scars remain. Each of us carries the weight of what we endured. The nights I spend lying awake, replaying the sounds of those twisted tests, remind me that there are corners of the world where human decency is as disposable as paper. Still, we survived. And in surviving, we shone a light on the darkness they had tried so hard to conceal. My life was ordinary, uneventful, really, until the day I noticed him, my double. At first, it seemed like a quirky coincidence. A friend spotted someone in the background of a photo taken at a cafe I'd never been to. The figure was blurry, just out of focus, but clearly resembled me. Same height, same build. Even the way he carried himself felt familiar. We laughed it off as a fluke, joking about long-lost twins or a doppelganger roaming the city. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, the resemblance was more pronounced, more unnerving. He appeared in different places, at different times, and always when I wasn't around to see it firsthand. A friend showed me a video of a street festival and paused it at just the right moment to point out a man standing near a vendor's cart. "Isn't that you?" he asked, though he knew full well it couldn't be. I studied the screen. Same face, same posture, even the same jacket I owned, except I'd never attended that festival. I tried to shrug it off, but the pattern became impossible to ignore. He was always just a step ahead of me. If I mentioned I was going to a new bookstore, a friend would later say they thought they saw me there earlier. If I planned a weekend walk through the park, someone would claim to have waved at me there the day before. At first, it was an eerie but distant puzzle. Then, it got personal. One night, walking home, I caught my reflection in a dark store window. Except it wasn't my reflection. It was him. His eyes met mine, and I froze. The hair on the back of my neck bristled. His face, my face, was expressionless, but there was something cold about it, something wrong. He stood still for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the darkness. That's when my life began to unravel. Every day, I felt his presence. At first, it was subtle, a shadow in my peripheral vision, a fleeting glance of someone in a crowd. Then it became undeniable. He wasn't just appearing randomly. He was following me, studying me. I'd sit in a coffee shop and feel his gaze through the window. I'd leave for work and swear I saw him watching from the alley across the street. Friends grew concerned as I became increasingly paranoid. "You're stressed," they said. "You need rest." They didn't see what I saw. Determined to confront him, I started tracking his movements. I mapped out the places he'd been seen, the times he'd shown up, and tried to predict where he'd appear next. It felt like chasing a ghost, always just out of reach, always one step ahead. My once normal routine turned into an obsessive hunt. I couldn't focus on work. I stopped returning calls. All that mattered was finding him and getting answers. It was at a small park, one I visited often, that I finally saw him in person. He was sitting on a bench, looking out at the pond, his posture relaxed. He seemed at ease, as though he belonged there more than I did. Summoning my courage, I approached. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. He turned his head slowly and smiled, a chilling, knowing smile. "You know who I am," he replied, his voice eerily similar to my own. "I'm you. Or maybe you're me." I stared at him, struggling to process his words. He stood and took a step closer, and I instinctively backed away. "Why are you doing this? Why are you following me?" I asked. He tilted his head, as if amused. "I'm not following you. I'm just ahead of you." Those words stayed with me long after he walked away. What did he mean? Ahead of me in what way? I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where the rules of reality no longer applied. He wasn't just a double. He was a reflection, an echo. But of what? I spent sleepless nights researching folklore, psychology, anything that might explain what was happening. The word doppelganger kept coming up, along with ominous tales of doubles as harbingers of doom or messengers from another realm. The more I read, the more I began to question my sanity. Was he real, or was he a manifestation of something within me? The next time we crossed paths, I tried a different approach. Instead of confronting him, I observed. He walked into a bookstore I'd never visited. I stayed outside, watching through the window as he browsed the shelves. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. It was almost as if he was performing for me, showing me something I couldn't quite grasp. Then he turned and looked directly at me through the glass. His expression wasn't angry or threatening, just knowing. "Stop this," I whispered to myself, my breath fogging the window. But he simply turned and walked out the back door. When I followed, he was gone. Weeks passed. The sightings continued, but I noticed something peculiar. The more I tried to ignore him, the less frequent they became. When I stopped chasing him, he seemed to lose interest. It was as though my attention gave him strength, made him real. And so, I made a choice. I stopped searching. I stopped acknowledging him, stopped letting him consume my thoughts. Over time, his appearances faded. Friends stopped mentioning glimpses of me in unexpected places. My reflection in windows was just that, a reflection. The weight on my chest began to lift, and I felt a semblance of normalcy return. Yet, deep down, I knew he wasn't truly gone. He was still out there, somewhere, waiting. But as long as I refused to feed his presence, he remained nothing more than a shadow on the edge of memory. The experience left me with questions I may never answer. Was he a figment of my mind, a psychological projection of my fears and anxieties? Or was he something otherworldly, a fragment of an unseen reality? Whatever the case, I learned that his power over me was never absolute. It came from my own fears, my own obsession. As I walk through the city now, I sometimes feel a twinge of unease when I pass a reflective surface. I glance, half expecting to see him, but all I see is my own face, looking back at me. And I remind myself, the power of a doppelganger isn't in their existence. It's in how much of our attention we give them, and I choose not to give him any. It started as a night full of promise, the moon hanging heavy and bright over the rural countryside. We were just a group of friends, bound by the easy camaraderie of a road trip, drawn away from the well-trodden highways by the allure of winding country roads and the promise of adventure. The night air was sharp and crisp, filled with the chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. Each turn in the road revealed a new canopy of trees, the world beyond the beam of our headlights shrouded in darkness and mystery. It was the kind of night that invited the unexpected. We didn't plan to pick up a hitchhiker. In fact, none of us had ever stopped for one before. But as we rounded a curve, the headlights caught a figure by the roadside. They stood motionless, their face shadowed by the angle of the moonlight, but their posture, hopeful, perhaps desperate, made us pause. Something about their stillness, the way their silhouette seemed out of place against the landscape, compelled us to slow down. We exchanged glances, a silent debate passing between us, before pulling over. The hitchhiker climbed into the back seat with a quiet, "Thank you," their voice soft and unassuming. They were young, not much older than we were, yet their eyes carried something heavy, a sorrow that seemed too deep for their years. Clad in a light jacket that seemed inadequate for the chill in the air, they folded into themselves, gazing out the window as if the world beyond the glass held answers to questions they could not voice. When asked where they were headed, they gave an address only a few miles down the road. Their hand, trembling slightly, pointed ahead. The drive passed mostly in silence. We tried to make conversation, light-hearted attempts to break the tension that had settled over the car, but the hitchhikers' replies were brief, their tone polite but distant. It was as if they existed in a world apart, and we were merely the means to an end. The air grew colder as we neared the address, and when we finally arrived, confusion set in. The house that matched their directions was shrouded in darkness, its windows broken and its walls cloaked in ivy. It was clear that no one had lived there in years. Turning to the hitchhiker for an explanation, we found the back seat empty. No door had opened, no sound had betrayed their departure. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone. The sudden absence left us shaken, our minds racing for an explanation that never came. Seeking answers, we drove into the nearest town and recounted our strange encounter. The locals listened, their expressions a mix of pity and unease. One elderly man finally spoke, his voice heavy with years of whispered tales. "That house," he said, "belonged to a family that came to a tragic end long before any of you were born. Every so often, someone sees someone on that road, a figure looking for a ride home, but they never make it back." It was then that the weight of our experience fully set in. We had encountered what the townsfolk called the vanishing hitchhiker, a figure known to appear on quiet nights, seeking a ride only to disappear upon reaching the house. We left the town in a daze, the once thrilling detour now burdened by a story that felt heavier with each retelling. Our road trip, once filled with laughter and the easy rhythm of friends exploring the unknown, turned introspective. The hitchhiker's presence lingered in our minds, transforming from a ghostly enigma into something more profound. What began as a single, eerie encounter sparked an obsession. We delved into the house's history, poring over old newspapers and speaking with anyone who would share what they knew. We learned of the family that had lived there, parents, a daughter, a life tragically cut short by an accident on the very road we had traveled. The hitchhiker, it seemed, was not a random ghost but a memory, a fragment of a life that had once been whole. Compelled by a need to understand, we returned to the house several times. Each visit was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Though the hitchhiker never appeared again, their presence was unmistakable. It was as if the air around the house held their essence, a lingering reminder of what had been lost. The more we learned, the more our fear gave way to respect and a strange sense of responsibility. The hitchhiker's story was no longer just a ghost tale. It was a piece of local history, a reminder that even in loss, memories can endure. One night, under the light of a full moon that mirrored the one from our first encounter, we held a small vigil at the house. We lit candles and shared what we had learned, honoring not just the hitchhiker but the family that had lived there. It felt like the right thing to do, a way to acknowledge their existence and ensure they would not be forgotten. The hitchhiker's tale became a thread that wove our group closer together. What had started as a simple road trip transformed into a journey of discovery, about the past, about ourselves, and about the connections that endure even beyond death. Each time we told the story, we found ourselves reflecting not just on the eerie details, but on the deeper meaning. The vanishing hitchhiker was more than a ghost. They were a reminder of life's fragility, of the marks we leave on the world, and of the stories that keep us alive in the memories of others. As we continued our travels, the story of the hitchhiker stayed with us, a testament to the power of history, memory, and the mysterious threads that bind us to the past. Each retelling invited questions, sparking conversations about loss, legacy, and the ways we confront the unknown. And so, Even as the roads led us to new places and new adventures, the hitchhiker's story remained. A haunting, beautiful reminder of the thin veil between the worlds we think we know and the mysteries that linger just beyond.